Half a score minus a dozen days ago, I won the Ultimate Typing Championship and accidentally became niche famous. As we approach the 10-year anniversary of that contest, I wanted to do something different today, and I'm wearing the very same DOS keyboard shirt from that competition to commemorate the occasion. I know I still haven't certified my 10 Fast Fingers Advanced English test record from half a year ago. That's because honestly, I kept forgetting how to stream. The last few times I tried to run the OBS broadcasting software, it said my computer was no longer compatible, even though it had worked on the same computer before. I had a refurbished computer from 2013 with a CPU from 2008 in it, and it was clearly on its last legs. But once I got my tax return back, I bought a new refurbished computer, and I just set it up last weekend, so I'm going to try again. Almost nobody was streaming back in 2008, so it makes sense that a lot of my streams were clunky, such as how whenever I tried to stream myself playing Nitro Type, my streams always crashed. This computer is still not brand new, but it should be recent enough that I can do everything I want for my purposes. It still wouldn't surprise me if I'm unable to stream Nitro Type, though. After too many times I tried to record myself typing and failed with the old computer, I kind of just gave up, although I have many new ideas for typing videos and even non-typing videos if I can get the OBS to work this time, which it looks like it is doing right now. If you're watching this, I was probably able to do it. I must say I'm getting kind of bored with competing on typing sites lately, although I certainly just entered the new TTM tournament in order to get a formal rematch with Czech, and I hope to complete my match on that tonight after I complete recording this video. But I primarily decided to record this video because I wanted to talk about my book, which I have mentioned in passing occasionally in YouTube comments and much more frequently on typing discords. I've mentioned many details of the content I want to include in the book over the past few years, but I never really put it together in a complete package until now. In the spring of 2017, I decided I wanted to write a book about the history of competitive typing, from the invention of the mechanical typewriter to the modern online typing scene. My chief inspiration was a blog written by Robert Messenger, the owner of the Australian Typewriter Museum. His post, The Last Days of Speed Typing Glory, listed all the typing champions from the first half of the 20th century. I knew almost nothing about any of them at the time and was even less aware that this was a seriously big deal for a while, so I was obsessed to learn more. The acclaimed indie video game designer Richard Hoffmeyer created a video game last year called Type Dreams that had cartoon facsimiles of many major typists throughout history, including me, and he also taught me quite a bit about the classic scene. I was astonished to learn big deal typing used to be. Typewriter manufacturers sent their top typists out on tour like they were rock stars. They showed off their skills at colleges, grade schools, newsrooms, granges, department stores, and veterans halls. The 10-time champion George Hosfield estimated that he had demonstrated in front of hundreds of thousands of people in his decades as a touring typist. The national competitions were held at venues that are still famous today, like Madison Square Garden and even Carnegie Hall. The typing champions appeared on radio shows, were name-checked in nationally syndicated comic strips, and even met royalty. These contests were also notable because they were among the very first regularly scheduled contests in the US that allowed men and women to compete on a level playing field, even before women had the right to vote. The more research I did, the more I learned that typing contests had an incredibly rich history that has almost been entirely forgotten. Only one of the early 20th century typing champions even has a Wikipedia page, and it's a stub article. I decided I wanted to discuss this history in addition to recounting the history of the modern online typing scene, which no one has ever done formally. Competitive typing today is probably the biggest it has been since the early 20th century. The advent of online competitive typing websites like 10 Fast Fingers, TypeRacer, and Nitro Type means probably more people are competing at this than at any previous point in history. These three sites in particular have grown pretty massive. To put it in perspective, their web traffic is either comparable to or greater than the official websites for NASCAR, the NCAA, and Brown University. That's pretty huge. Unfortunately, no online competitive typist has yet been offered the millions in salary that a top NASCAR driver gets. I've been paycheck to paycheck at best for my entire life. I wasn't even able to land a civil service typing job despite being the supposed fastest typist in the world. Regardless, while competitive typing still lacks a formal tournament structure, unlike many other types of games, there is clearly becoming a huge market for this waiting to be tapped, and I don't think most people even in the scene realize how big this has gotten over the years. I myself was honestly shocked when a couple of other type racer stars told me students at their respective college campuses talk to them about it in their offline lives. I had never seen much of that personally. People on the streets of Syracuse did not come up to me and say, "Dude, I just saw your typing video." This led to the weird dichotomy of being sort of famous online and a complete nonentity offline. Imagine how weird it feels that I seem to be partially responsible for increasing the popularity of typing, which was certainly not something I expected or even desired. The social network claimed that the internet is not written in pencil, it's written in ink. Aaron Sorkin was wrong about that. I've seen lots of websites from my youth in the 90s that I loved entirely disappear without a trace, unsearchable even by the Internet Archive. Most of my old GeoCities sites from my teen years are entirely gone. Although online competitive typing is booming right now, online content, much like old non-primetime TV shows, is pretty ephemeral compared to old world media. Lots of stuff is still getting lost. For instance, the entire history of the TypeRacer Discord was deleted by a hacker in 2018, and that annoyed me because it made some elements of my research harder, although I've recovered from that at this point. Since it seems few people have formally written about the online competitive typing scene in traditional print media, I wanted to give back to the typing community and fill that gap. Hey guys, can you hear me okay? I just typed. In addition to Robert Messenger and Richard Hoffmeyer, I want to credit some more influences who inspired this project. I've read several books and watched several movies about mind sports and gaming competitions, such as Stefan Fatz's Word Freak about tournament Scrabble, Ken Jennings' Brainiac about trivia culture, Joshua Foer's Moonwalking with Einstein about memory competitions, and the documentaries Spellbound about the National Spelling Bee, Wordplay about the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, and The King of Kong about the people competing for the all-time Donkey Kong record. I've followed this genre enough to understand the pattern and the structure of these works, and I want my book to be the same sort of thing for typing. Like these works, I want to focus primarily on the personalities in typing, along with a bit of personal memoir material, rather than just making this merely some book of records, which would be dreadfully boring. I'll certainly intersperse that stuff in where it's applicable, but I want this to be an entertaining read as well as informative. In the same vein as the other works in the nerd competition genre, I chose a similarly silly pun for the title of my book, which is Nerds Per Minute. At the moment, it looks like the book will be around 500 pages, and I plan on having 17 chapters. That is probably way too long, so at some later point I will likely have to make some painful cuts. The first 8 chapters will primarily focus on the classic typing scene prior to the 21st century, while the last 9 will focus on the current online era. I have written almost 250 pages already and nearly finished the second half of the book about the modern scene. I'm trying to finish this part by the start of spring, but I might just miss that. I've written little of the first half yet, but have completed about 70% of the research I need in order to do so. I purchased and read a few books on the history of the mechanical typewriter. I read an article on how the current positions of the letters on the QWERTY keyboard came to be. I read a bunch of posts on various typing history blogs. I managed to find and purchase a number of the actual booklets that typing champions used in competitions in the 1910s and 20s, but I haven't really looked at them yet because I might want to type them myself here on YouTube to compare how I do to the past champions, and I don't want to spoil it. Admittedly, it's kind of apples and oranges comparing typists from the mechanical typewriter era to today, because it is much harder to press a key on mechanical typewriters than modern plastic computer keyboards, not to mention that you no longer have to pull a carriage return and you're able to correct your errors before printing something. I bought and read through the entirety of August Dvorak's typing book, Typewriting Behavior, and I surprisingly found that although I think a lot of the logic behind the Dvorak keyboard layout is wrong, he understood typing mechanics more than anybody else I've ever read nonetheless, even though I've read in newspaper articles that Dvorak wasn't even a typist himself. Similarly, I joined a newspaper archive site and trawled through every mention of the championship-winning typist of the first half of the 20th century, along with many of the other prominent typists of the era, and I got a lot of great material as a result. I was not quite as successful in making contacts with 20th century typists or their relatives, but I did manage to interview Martin Tangora, the son of Albert Tangora, who won 7 typing championships in the 20s and 30s, and set the all-time record for fastest speed over an hour on a mechanical typewriter. Martin, a retired math professor, is still alive, and he gave me a lot of good information about the classic typing scene to complement my own research. I've naturally had much better luck with the 21st century typists, so I've interviewed around 30 typists and or creators of typing sites from the online era in order to perfectly capture the history of the last 15 years of typing, even though I've been there for most of it. After I finish the half about the online scene over the next few months, I plan on writing about the classic scene in earnest, and I think that'll go much faster because I can mostly use written material for that and don't need to schedule interviews for the most part. My goal is to finish the book by the end of 2020, but too often I distract myself by reading stuff online, and I've gotten a lot weaker physically in recent years, making it harder to focus, but I'm going to try to push myself to finish this year. Even for the chapters I haven't written yet, I have a general idea in my head for the content I want to include. For each chapter, I intend to have a clever title, usually some kind of stupid pun along the same lines as my book title, as well as a fitting chapter quote to try to sum up that chapter's material. And I'm definitely going for funny chapter quotes, as often as possible too. The most hilarious one was when I read Cortez Peters Jr. argue the release of his typing instructional guide was as important as the polio vaccine. He was probably joking. At least I hope he was joking. Can you all hear me okay? I haven't gotten any notes about the content yet, but thanks for the compliments. I have not come up with a title I like for the first chapter yet, but that chapter will include biographical information on the life of Christopher Latham Sholes, along with the other people involved in the development of the first mass-marketed typewriter, such as James Densmore, Carlos Glidden, and George W.N. Yost. Although Sholes is remembered as the sole inventor of the typewriter, there were many machines that imprinted letters onto paper prior to his. They simply weren't called typewriters, so I'll also write about some of the earlier typewriters that predated Sholes. Additionally, I will write about how the QWERTY keyboard layout came to be, and also how Sholes decided which keys to include on the keyboard and where to place them. This chapter will also include information about how Remington came to purchase Sholes' typewriter, and also how the Remington Arms Company and Remington Typewriter Company eventually split off into two separate companies that had nothing to do with each other besides sharing the same name. I still have a lot of research to do here to complete this to my satisfaction. One of the predecessors to the typewriter was called a literary piano, and I find that enjoyably quaint. I may use that in the chapter title somewhere. The second chapter is tentatively called When Typewriters Fly, a pun on When Pigs Fly. In this chapter, I intend to write about the history of the other major mechanical typewriter companies that emerged after Remington. I will be mostly focusing on three manufacturers: the Calligraph, which was the second mass-marketed typewriter; the Underwood, which was the first typewriter to eclipse the Remington in popularity and dominated the industry in the early 20th century; and the Royal, which was generally considered the most well-crafted typewriter in the mechanical typewriter era and eventually overtook Underwood in performance and popularity around World War II. I will probably briefly mention some of the other typewriters, along with their corporate shenanigans, like the moment when 5 typewriter companies joined in a typewriter trust in the late 1800s, which is actually what caused QWERTY to become the industry standard layout. Additionally, I will write about the earliest typing contest in the 1880s and 90s, along with how typewriters became mainstream in the corporate world and allowed an entry for women in business offices for the first time. This is the area for which I am clearly lacking the most in research, and some of the material might end up going in the first chapter instead. The title is named for a promotional gimmick where the Royal Typewriter Company would toss box typewriters from hot air balloons in order to prove their durability. They almost never broke. The third chapter is tentatively titled The Underwood Invitational, but I don't like that very much. This chapter will recount the period when a competitive typing circuit began to form, with regularly scheduled competitions replacing the more haphazardly organized ones of the 1880s and 90s. While there were several major championships in this period in the 1900s and 10s, the International Championship was always held at the New York Business Show, which was always headquartered at the city's finest venues and exhibition halls. I'll discuss J.N. Kimball, the main organizer of the official competitions of this era, along with the champions of his contests. Most of my emphasis in this chapter will be placed on Rose Fritz, who won the first 4 international championships consecutively from 1906 to 09, and Margaret Owen, who won 4 out of 5 championships from 1913 to 17, and also set the fastest 1-minute time on a mechanical typewriter, a record that was listed in Guinness for decades. Both of them wrote books as well, and Owen's was the most entertaining typing book I've ever read. She had the wit of Dorothy Parker or some of the Algonquin table writers. Most of my material on them will probably come from their books, but I haven't read Fritz's book yet. The title stems from the fact that what began as a competition between Underwood and Remington ended up being dominated by Underwood to such a degree that almost all the other typewriter manufacturers for the most part, didn't even attempt to compete by the 20s. The next chapter, the Silk City Dynasty, is named after the nickname of Paterson, New Jersey, the small city that somehow spawned almost all the greatest typists of the 20s. George Hosfield and Albert Tangora, who combined to win 17 typing championships, including every single championship from 1920 to 1937, both hailed from Paterson, and for a while even the third fastest typist, Barney Stapert, came from there too. The chapter will focus almost entirely on Tangora and Hosfield, but will address a few of their contemporaries as well, most notably Cortez Peters, the first great African-American typist. Peters came of age in the mid-1920s, which was probably the most racist period in American history since the Civil War. Peters faced major setbacks in his heyday, as when he won the amateur championship in 1925, it was never reported in newspapers, even though newspaper articles of the typing competitions routinely mentioned the amateur and novice championship winners every other year except to that one. Although Underwood hired several typists to tour the nation for them, including some who were about as fast or even slower than Peters, they never gave him an opportunity. He did manage to overcome great hardship and started a chain of 3 business schools in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Chicago in the 30s. Around the same time, the Royal Typewriter Company did hire him as a touring typist, and Tangora also defected Underwood for Royal around the same time, when Underwood cut his salary in half during the Great Depression. The competitive typing scene went on hiatus from 1931 to 34 during the Depression because they were unable to find a venue. This was never actually formally stated anywhere, but it is my opinion based on reading between the lines in tons of articles that claimed Underwood stopped holding contests because of a lack of competition. It's always about the money. I think I'm right. I will spend the remainder of the chapter discussing the hiatus of the contest during the Depression, the brief period when there were 2 rival typing championships that each claimed to be the official one, much like the FIDE PCA split in chess or the CART IRL split in IndyCar racing, and Peters finally successfully integrating the competitive typing world, thereby opening the door for later great black typists like his son Ron Mingo and Jelani Nelson. Chapter 5, Typing Becomes Electric, a pun on the play Morning Becomes Electra, focuses on the period when electric typewriters overtook mechanical typewriters in performance for the first time in the 40s. In this chapter, I cover the 2 great IBM typists, Margaret Hama and Stella Pajunas, who in that period set the fastest hour and minute typing records in the years immediately before and after World War II. Pajunas's record of 216 words per minute over an entire minute would stand for decades, arguably until I broke it with 220 words per minute on 10 fast fingers, although I find hers more impressive because typing on an electric typewriter is not as easy as typing on a computer keyboard. And also, I believe that she was also typing capitalization and punctuation, and 10 fast fingers doesn't require you to do that. I will then discuss how the International Typing Championship fizzled out in the post-war period after that, and how the IBM Selectric typewriter and electric typewriters in general ultimately dominated the typewriter market for decades until the rise of the personal computer. Chapter 6, Dvorak's New Keyboard Symphony, a pun on the similarity between the names of the composer Antonin Dvorak and the keyboard layout creator Auguste Dvorak, will discuss the keyboard layouts that were designed as alternatives to QWERTY. I've read several places that Dvorak and Dvorak are supposedly related, but I have as of yet been unable to prove that. The primary emphasis will be on Dvorak, the most famous such layout. I will largely focus on Dvorak's life and research, and this chapter will largely summarize Dvorak's findings in his magnum opus, Typewriting Behavior. There were, however, several alternative layouts that emerged after the calligraph and before the Dvorak, and I'll likely talk about a few of them briefly as well. I'll almost certainly talk about the more modern Colmac layout, which attempted to bridge the divide between QWERTY and Dvorak. I may eventually try and see if I can get an interview with Colmac creator Shai Coleman. I posted on the Colmac forum a couple times, so I likely have some connections there. Chapter 7, which I don't have a good title for yet, will focus on the typists from the second half of the 20th century. Although there were no longer formalized national or international typing contests in this period, apart from the Intersteno Congress, which usually only Europeans attended in that era, a handful of American typists went on to niche fame for their typing abilities. The most famous of these typists, of course, was Barbara Blackburn, because of her David Letterman appearance, which you can find on YouTube. But in addition to her, I'm going to write about Cortez Peters Jr., who might get my vote as the greatest typist in history. He supposedly typed 297 words per minute over an entire minute at a demonstration for Xerox in the 80s, but I'm finding that hard to verify. Ron Mingo, who exhibited his typing on the proto-reality show Real People, which you can also find on YouTube. Michael Shestov, who set the all-time record for typing numbers in 5 minutes without making an error, and Wayne Stoller, whose win in the Keytronic World Invitational Type-Off in Las Vegas in 1991 netted him $10,000, the greatest prize in competitive typing history when unadjusted for inflation. I surprisingly have found this era to be substantially more difficult to find information on than the early 20th century, even though it is much more recent. A lot of these people largely gained their fame through television appearances on talk shows and the like, and it's harder to find archives of ephemeral television shows than it is for newspapers. If nobody made a VHS tape of some local news appearance or whatever, it might already be gone. These typists, by and large, did not get talked about in newspapers nearly as often as Albert Tangora and George Hosfield did. I need to fill a ton of gaps in my research here. I tried to call up Keytronic asking if anyone there had any information on their contest, but I found nothing. While they were one of the biggest keyboard manufacturers of the 90s, they have since evolved into working mostly on emergency medical services in recent years, so I'm finding very little information about this contest at all. The era immediately before the mainstream internet is weirdly becoming this memory hole because newspapers were already folding and contracting, and television shows in the pre-DVD era were not meant to last, especially talk shows and things like that. So it's often way harder to find things from the recent past than you might think. As a result, this chapter may actually be the hardest of all to complete. Shestov did agree to an interview with me, but I haven't gotten around to that yet because I wanted to finish the second half of the book first. I have tentatively called Chapter 8 Beasts of Inner Steno Nation, a pun on the recent American movie Beast of No Nation. I may have to change that because I don't think the Inner Steno people will like it very much, even though I only intended it as a silly pun. This chapter focuses on the formal typing contests held outside the United States. A lot of people may find my earlier chapters to be too Americentric, but that is actually justified. For the most part, the Americans have always been the fastest typists in the world, with occasional exceptions. European champions entered the 20s and 30s international contests in the US and repeatedly came in last. English is an easier language to type than most other languages because it doesn't have accent marks, but for whatever reason, the British typing scene has never been very strong. For instance, right now, there are 37 American typists on the top 100 of the English leaderboard on Typing Zone, but only 2 at the moment are British. While the US has substantially more people than the UK, the disparity shouldn't be that large, especially when you consider that Typing Zone is a French site that was almost entirely dominated by Europeans in its earliest years. As a result, the Americans have usually dominated typing contests over the years, but there were still many great typists outside the US, and this chapter focuses on them. I briefly discussed the history of the Intersteno Congress in general, including the years before the typing contests were officially established in 1955. At times, Intersteno had several different contests, such as one for typing on a mechanical typewriter, one for typing on an electric typewriter without being allowed to correct errors, and one for typing on an electric typewriter with error correction being allowed. Nowadays, the first 2 of those contests no longer exist, and the main Intersteno typing contest is the direct descendant of the last of these. I also write about the great Intersteno typists throughout history, most of whom hailed from France, Germany, the Czech Republic, and Turkey, and I also write about the emergence of Intersteno's more recent internet contest. I conclude the chapter by also talking a bit about the Japanese typing scene, whose Real Force Championship has probably become the most lucrative typing contest that is held every year. With Chapter 9, the competition will be digitized, a pun on the Gil Scott-Heron spoken word proto-rap song, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. I begin to switch my focus to the modern typing scene. I will probably discuss several of the early typing programs for DOS and Windows, like Mavis Beacon, the much less famous CPT Personal Touch Typing, which was the one I learned on, Typing of the Dead, and so on. But I doubt I'll spend a lot of time on them because those were offline programs people used at home, and they were seldom ever used for competition, which is my interest here. I'll probably only focus on the early apps that the top millennial typists used in the early pre-mainstream internet era. Most of the chapter will discuss the 6 online-only websites that I feel are particularly historically significant: Typing Zone, Typer A, HighGames.net, 10 Fast Fingers, TypeRacer, and Nitro Type. I also briefly mention a bunch of minor typing sites that aren't especially important but had their merits. For the 6 major sites, I got exclusive interviews with their creators, helping me to better understand these sites' historical contexts. Chapter 10, Chairman of the Keyboard, profiles the original generation of internet typing stars, the ones who emerged from 2002 to 2009 before I came on the scene. This chapter begins with Eric Lee Chung, the first online typing star, before going on to discuss Dan Chen, Jelani Nelson, Karen Kulakian, Andre Christescu, David Pritz, Noah Horn, Mako 640, Chris Malmquist, and Guillermo Sandrini, better known as Cocaine. I hope I didn't mispronounce anybody's last name because in several cases I've only read their names and never heard them pronounced. This was the only era when all the major typing stars were male, hence the chapter title. The next 3 chapters, 11 to 13, will consist of mostly biographical memoir material from me. The first of these chapters, The Special Ed Kid, focuses on my childhood through my graduation from high school. I talk about my autism, my eating disorder, my complete isolation from the outside world, my early history in special ed classes, and my relative poverty in childhood. On the flip side, I also discuss the vague memories I have of how I taught myself to type as a 3-year-old, my early gifts for mental arithmetic and MS-DOS era computing, my participation as the youngest player ever in Mensa Scrabble by mail group, although I never actually belonged to Mensa, nor do I want to join. It's confusing. My early auto racing fandom and the fantasy games I invented, along with my first websites for that purpose. I also talk about a bunch of other stuff. Chapter 12, Cosmopolitan meets Neckbeard, is a reference to the Ultimate Typing Championship, which closes the chapter. Obviously, Nate Bowen is the Cosmopolitan, while I am the Neckbeard. This chapter starts briefly with my Cornell years, which I hated. I talk about why I failed to connect there and why I feel I never truly connected in intellectual or sophisticated circles. I briefly talk about my first job out of college for an extremely corrupt statistical consulting firm, along with the launch of my first major website, the auto racing archive, racedatabase.com. Then I discuss how at basically the same moment I quit my consulting job at the height of the Great Recession, I joined many competitive typing sites and suddenly became a star, culminating with my win in the Ultimate Typing Championship at the end of the chapter. I include my observations about the contest, which I enjoyed, and the South by Southwest conference itself, which I mostly didn't. I also spend a few pages writing about Kevin Tehan, who qualified for the Ultimate Typing Championship semifinals, but didn't realize he'd advanced because he forgot to check his email. Kevin was also autistic and later committed suicide, and I'm going to dedicate the book to him, along with Carlo Parisi, who was an Intersteno internet champion who also died recently. Chapter 13, Least Likely to Succeed, was named after an awful novel I was writing shortly after the Ultimate Typing Championship during a long spell of unemployment. Here I talk about the last decade, and particularly the era when I was becoming famous enough that people made all sorts of weird requests for things they wanted me to do, but simultaneously no employer would give me the time of day. For much of this chapter, I talk about the aforementioned game designer, Richard Hoffmeyer, who helped influence this book and paid for me to go to the Cincy Typing Challenge, the 2013 contest where Robert Price won $5,000, the largest prize in recent typing history. My participation in this contest was kind of a fiasco and probably a low point for my life, but I did interview Robert to understand how the contest worked and how he trained himself to type on the diabolical TrueGrip device, which I couldn't figure out at all. It was a prototype keyboard shaped vaguely like a banana that had the usually left-hand keys on the top and the right-hand keys on the bottom, and it failed to register a very high percentage of the key presses. Getting this to work ended up being more of an engineering exercise than a typing one, and Robert was clearly a much better engineer. Not to mention, I was unable to even get a bus ride back for the finals and got stranded in the Cincinnati bus terminal for almost a whole day because the return bus was overbooked by the time I got there. I also briefly talk about my job archiving sports statistics for Sports Reference LLC, my forays into tournament Scrabble, my more recent auto racing research, and my failing health as of late. Chapter 14, The Ascent of the Gamers, that is ASCENT, not ASSENT, discusses the modern generation of typists who mostly emerged in the second half of the 2010s. This chapter begins with Michael DeRoche and ends with Czech. I also talk about Izzy, Kathy Chang, Eric Trider, Fida, Aaron Adams, VL, Hunter Schaefer, and Alpha Panda. This chapter, much like Chapter 10, is almost entirely drawn from interviews with type alongside personal memories of the scene. However, while the original generation of typists for the most part cared more about their academic pursuits than gaming, this generation was for the most part more into gaming than academics. I talk about how Desroches modernized typewriter by banning numerous cheaters that had occupied the leaderboard for years, added thousands of quotes to the site, a project I also contributed to, and managed to break the record for the most races in typewriter history in only 2 years, despite not joining the site until it was 7 years old. I also talk about how the new typewriter Discord and Noah Horn's typewriter championship helped resuscitate competitive typing after its doldrums in the middle part of the decade. Chapter 15, Season of the Twitch, a pun on the Donovan song Season of the Witch, focuses on the streaming of typing games. I start out by pontificating about whether typing has a future. I argue it doesn't, and why typing can be as popular as it is without anybody seeming to be able to live off it as people in some other games do. I talked to a couple of the most famous streaming gamers, Siglemic and Reckful, who became famous for playing other video games before both of them became addicted to typing games in particular for a while. I asked them what they felt the key differences were that made their more famous games so marketable while typing games were not. I also talked about Reckful's huge influence in mainstreaming typing games to an audience who primarily played more popular and famous video games. Before segueing to discuss Reckful's most successful follower and fellow World of Warcraft star Terran, who went on to become the current typewriter world record holder. This chapter culminates in a discussion of the Clicking Championship, the largest and most successful online tournament in typing history, where Terran co-hosted the live stream. And I might possibly talk about this contest that's going on this week at the end of this chapter. This concludes the historical typing chapters, but I still have a little more to say. Chapter 16, Typeracer Metrics, is a chapter where I go through the Typeracer logs of finished races for 16 of the most prominent users in Typeracer history to try to understand the top typists' individual typing styles, as well as determining the fastest and slowest keys to type on the QWERTY keyboard, as well as other layouts, although I only included one Dvorak and one Comac typist in this study because there are substantially fewer typists in general on those layouts, and most of them are much slower than the fastest QWERTY typists to begin with, except for Viper. I will also determine what the fastest and slowest words are on average. I've confirmed the popular consensus that power is the fastest word on the QWERTY keyboard on average. Typeracer provides the number of milliseconds it takes to type each key, and although it is primarily used to detect cheaters, there are many other things that can be done with these data that haven't really been explored yet, which I will do in this chapter. I also calculate typist duplication time, how quickly each typist types the same character twice in a row, reaction time, who starts quotes the fastest, faster or slower on certain characters to see what strategies and techniques can be learned from that. The title is a portmanteau of Typeracer as well as Racer Metrics, my advanced auto racing and analysis website, which itself was a pun on the baseball term sabermetrics. Racer Metrics is also the name of my NitroType clan. I never wanted to have a NitroType clan in the first place, but the users of that site are persistent, and they eventually got me. My final chapter, Ronian Motion, is a pun on Brownian motion. I know, what a dork, right? And it is here where I go into considerably more detail than I ever have before in providing typing advice and strategies for improvement. People have asked me for typing advice for many years. Early on, I was never very good at it because I couldn't even remember how I taught myself to type. But having read a lot of typing manuals, analyzed people's typing logs, and watch myself practicing how I type a wide variety of words, I can now go into great detail on how to type each individual letter on the keyboard. I go through my personal strategies for typing every key, where you should center your hands. Hint, it's not on the home row if you're using QWERTY. Which types of words you should speed up and slow down on, and what the best sort of typing rhythm is. I do not agree with the advice that Albert Tangora and George Hosfield gave nearly a century ago on this matter. I also briefly address which types of keyboards are faster for typing. My opinion is that it's negligible, but either mechanicals or chiclets are slightly better than rubber domes. Whether there are correlations between typing and other types of skills, whether there is value in teaching typing in the classroom, and I finished with a stereotypically pompous ending or an attempt to argue that the history of typing actually serves in its humble way as a microcosm of the history of our times. But I think I can kind of make that case because I will be covering heavier stuff than you might think in this: women's rights, racism, suicide, corporate corruption, and the like. The draft for this chapter, the three about me, and the chapter about the typist after me are done at the moment, although I'll likely change some things when editing. A few others, including Season of the Twitch, are nearly finished as well. First off, is there anything you think I'm missing here? Any important aspects to typing, its history, or its mechanics that you think I'm ignoring? I can't think of anything, but I do want to be comprehensive. As I said, I believe I'm nearly finished with the second half, but I've written very little of the first. Having said that, I do think I've completed most of the research I need already and should complete this by the end of the year. Since I asked for any comments, I'll look for the comments now. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joseph, for wanting to buy it. Yep, I got the cam working. Nah, it's too late for me to stream. It's already midnight here, and I've got to go to work tomorrow. If the person comes back to do my MMT match, I'll go do that and maybe try and stream that on here. Yeah, right. No questions really, so I'll go on. One of the points of this video is that I am thinking about launching a Patreon to support the book's completion. This is for a variety of reasons. One is to see whether I can build a large enough audience to create a groundswell of anticipation to help me attract a publisher. Another is because I know there is already a lot of interest from members of the typing communities, and I know many of them would love sneak peeks of the book before it comes out. Another reason is to motivate me to work faster. I've been going at this for almost 3 years now, on and off, but I end up just drifting off many days and not getting anything done. Far too many nights I just read online articles or worse, comments sections about all sorts of topics, usually politics or music or auto racing. Well, there are worse vices to be sure, but especially as my health is declining, I want an incentive to push me to work faster before I become too sick to finish. Giving myself public deadlines on a site like Patreon would likely be a great motivator to finish sooner. Finally, I've still been paycheck to paycheck for basically my entire life, and I'm consistently so broke I can't afford to pay for a crisis, and we've had a bunch in recent months. A gas line broke in our basement, causing a carbon monoxide leak and required us to call an ambulance we couldn't really afford. Our downstairs toilet no longer works because we think the emergency personnel got something stuck in it while they were trying to blow the carbon monoxide out of the house. Since I have irritable bowel syndrome, that's really annoying. At least I do have 2 toilets in my house. Our car had a broken crank, which almost caused us to blow our engine en route to the repair place for an entirely different reason, but thankfully that did not happen. And all that happened in the last 4 months alone. I did receive a fairly substantial tax return this year, which allowed me to finally replace my Rust Bucket computer and properly stream this, and I'm doing a little better now, I guess. I haven't been as sick most of the last month. Over the past 6 or 7 years, I've had all sorts of weird symptoms making me generally miserable. On many mornings around 2012 to 2014, my eyes fused shut when I woke up in the morning and I was unable to fully open them for as much as a half hour or even an hour. I think the temples on my metal glasses were digging into my nose, and goop from my nose was getting into my eyes while I slept. This even happened once on a day when I went to a Scrabble tournament, but I somehow managed to find a 9-letter bingo in a game where I couldn't open my eyes. This finally went away after I switched from metal to plastic glasses, although I just got a new pair of plastic glasses a couple weeks ago, and it seems to be happening again. I guess I've got to wear a Band-Aid until I can get back to the Band-Aid on my nose until I can get back to the eye doctor again to have them adjusted. In addition to my IBS, I also have autism, anxiety, depression, fibromyalgia, my eating disorder, ARFID, and I think I have OCD too, but I don't have a diagnosis for that. For several years, I had chest pain on my left side almost daily, although it wasn't cardiac, and that too went away very recently. A couple months ago, I woke up to explosive diarrhea more and more often, but that kind of faded. I have headaches almost every day from the omnipresent fluorescent lights everywhere when I'm in a building, not at home, and that's common among people who have autism and fibromyalgia. Extreme light sensitivity seems to be one of the physical manifestations of autism. About a month or 2 ago, I started to regularly have blurred vision, but that faded in the past few weeks, and I think my prescription may have just changed, so it looks like that's gotten better. I have to leave early from work once every other week or so due to an IBS attack. Some days I'm even whipped after a trip to Walmart. I basically never want to go anywhere that isn't absolutely necessary anymore. It's probably part of the reason I stopped going to Scrabble tournaments. And I mean, all this stuff is probably one of the main reasons I've lost a lot of interest in typing. What was really funny though is as I was having more and more symptoms, I was still getting faster and faster, which proves, in my opinion, that typing is not a physical thing at all. It's entirely mental, and I don't think any of my issues have affected my ability to think or reason or anything. Even though there are a lot of times I'm not in any particularly intense pain, my rotating set of symptoms that seems to frequently change from week to week or from month to month is making me paranoid that I'm going to be too sick to work pretty soon. And I want to supplement my income in case of that. So that's definitely a part of it too. But really the main thing about the Patreon is to build an audience and see if there's more potential than I realize, because I'm trying to make this entertaining as well as informative. I don't want this to be as boring as a Guinness book. I mean, the World Almanac was always better than the Guinness book to me. Since I already have 5 chapters entirely written and I'm 2 interviews short of basically being complete with 7, I certainly have a good head start. And if I do a Patreon, I'm thinking about releasing a chapter every week or every other week. Actually, every month. Once a week, I'd run out pretty soon. It'll be every other week or every month. I'm also thinking about offering gold, silver, and bronze tiers. Maybe for starters, I would offer bronze subscribers chapter previews, silver subscribers chapter previews and hard copies, and gold subscribers chapter previews and signed hard copies. Of course, I need an actual publisher if I wanted to offer book copies to subscribers, and I don't have a publisher yet. I think I want a conventional publisher to see if I can get this in bookstores, but I'll self-publish if I have to. I might offer additional perks to gold subscribers, like the ability to request me to put up some certain kind of typing video, or maybe I could calculate how quickly gold subscribers type each character on typewriter to help them understand their personal typing style or something. If I'm serious about this, I will try to relearn how to stream, as you can see I'm doing here, and how to use the broadcasting software, so I can give a shout out to anyone who subscribes to me at the end of my videos. And I've done enough research that I certainly have lots of ideas for future videos at this point. Enough probably for the next year even, although with the rate I upload things, it might not be more than once a month. If there are times when I don't have a chapter ready, I may try to put up some other kind of content. I've usually got several obsessive statistical projects going on that I never show anyone. I might do a separate Patreon for my auto racing research, since I'm planning 2 books for that material as well. But I think the typing stuff should take priority, since far more people are interested in me as a typist and a racing historian and analyst, and I know it. But I might throw some of that stuff in as bonus content in a typing Patreon as well. Probably wouldn't work though. I know a bit about Patreon, mainly because I've listened to several podcasts that Patreon users sponsor, but I'm not really sure how to structure this if I do it. I have no idea what the extent of my potential audience is, how much I should charge for each tier, how frequently I should update, or whether I should include both of my book projects on the same account, when it's unlikely most people interested in one will be interested in the other. Do any of my YouTube followers use Patreon and have any ideas here? I definitely want to try this, but I don't really know what I'm doing. I'll try to start making more videos this year too, although I might be even more incompetent at that. I definitely have several ideas in the near future. Verifying my 10 fast fingers advanced record will be the first thing, obviously. Setting more 10 fast fingers records in other languages, I'll probably try. I'm not going to go after Czech's record again. I know I can't break that, so I'm not going to bother. Typing one of those old championship booklets from the 20s to see how I square off against the old champions. I might do that at some point. Maybe trying to break the Guinness records for typing the alphabet and the numbers from 1 to 50, along with Michael Shestov's record for typing the most consecutive numbers in 5 minutes. I think the first 2 would be easy to break, but the last would be difficult. I definitely have the speed to beat Shestov, but I don't have the accuracy to type over 800 numbers in a row without making an error, I don't think. Probably only Taro Yada or Aaron Adams could possibly do that. But even Aaron told me he doesn't think he could do any better than 1 typo a minute. I know I've talked way too long, and it's maybe getting far too TL semicolon DR for you, so I'm going to cut it off here. But if you've made it this far, thanks for listening. I hope to have much more content in the future than I usually do. And now I'll respond to whatever comments I got. Yeah, I mean, I'm not in much pain right now. I'm okay now, but yeah, I go through weird stuff a lot, and I mean, most of my fans care about typing much more than I do. Well, I enjoyed all this research and stuff, but actually doing it, it gets dull and monotonous for me, kind of. Although I still, if I win this MMT tournament over Czech, I might bow out for a while at live competition. Well, I don't think I have done any live competition actually, except for a couple hundred races on type racing since the clicking championship. Um, yeah, hey Volhosis. Um, I'm only spending a few pages on my health stuff at all. I mean, I'm talking a lot about a lot of different things in the biographical and in my biographical chapters. It's not just health stuff. I'm trying really hard not to be narcissistic, and I think 3 chapters is the perfect compromise there. No Nail, I never read that. Um, yeah, I mean, being extremely online tends to make people generally depressed. I mean, that's why Michael DeRoche in October, he entirely got offline. Keegan Tournay is going to break his record for most races very soon, but Michael, he's in a better place now. He was really depressed himself, and he's been happier since he went offline. Social media can be pretty toxic, and yeah, I actually go after the people who made fun of me in those YouTube videos for the Ultimate Typing Championship. I probably shouldn't. It's probably not advisable, but I'm going to. An ebook. Yeah, I know that's something that exists. I mean, if I did that, I'd probably go through Amazon or something. I'd like to do it through somebody other than Amazon because I don't like their business practices much, but I mean just putting a PDF on a Patreon and selling it that way. I mean, that's something I could do without even having to release it publicly, I guess. Um, Jesus, but with glasses, I'm not sure anybody really knows what Jesus looked like, and I mean, I know the movie depictions aren't accurate. Old booklet competition, yeah. If I used to have the typing booklets right next to where I'm sitting, but I don't remember where they are. I may try and put them on show some of them on a stream. I showed some of them to Roche on a Skype chat once. Um, yeah, Joseph, I said that I thought it was going to be around 500 pages, but I know that's way too long. So there's going to be a lot of stuff I'm going to have to cut. Probably a lot of the stuff about me, and I'm probably being way too self-indulgent there. Yeah, I think Patreon would be better for it than Kickstarter or GoFundMe because Patreon is supposed to be more about content creators, while I associate Kickstarter more with startup corporations and GoFundMe more with people paying medical bills. I think Patreon is the best fit. Um, yeah, Volhosis just said in the chat who my first race is against. Killin, Kilin. Um, yeah, I mean this is mostly about typing history. I still only have like 2 chapters of typing advice. I definitely could not do an entire book of typing advice because I still don't have it that much. Although I have a lot more typing advice than I used to, and I shared some of it with Tim Jeffrey on the Type Racer Discord too, and he's going to be using some of that information, I think, for some videos he is making. Um, yeah, I just my computer was definitely on its last legs, being like 12 years old. But I'm glad to see this computer is new enough that um, streaming works. I mean, it occurs to me that almost nobody was streaming in 2008, so it makes sense that it wasn't very working very well at that. since I don't seem to be breaking up or anything here, maybe I'll even be able to stream NitroType on this. Not that I'm a huge fan of that site, but I mean, it's better than a lot of them, a lot of the ones that no longer exist, especially. Um, Deroche wasn't really angry about scores glitching. I think he intentionally saved an absurdly high score um, right before he got offline just because, well, he's obsessed with setting every record for um, any reason, even the pointless records. Like I recall Michael is trying to set the slowest ever score on typewriter, and he managed to do it just to do that before anybody else. I mean, I found that really silly and weird, but I don't think typewriter ever made Michael angry. It was an escape for him. Oh, Gary Hall, there's a name from long ago. Haven't you on a typing site in a long time? Um, um, I didn't I didn't talk about endurance typing much at all except for DeRoche, but I may add stuff about the person who typed for 11 straight days if I can find stuff in the chapter where I'm talking about Barbara Blackburn and Ron Mingo and Cortez Peters Jr. and so on. Um, yeah, I'm not going to talk about family stuff on a stream. Um, yeah, maybe I can do more advice stuff. I mean, I know that's typically what is done here. I've read George Hosfield's book, which was very boring. I read Cortez Peters Jr.'s book, the one he compared in importance to the polio vaccine, and that was very boring also. Um, Margaret Owens was really funny. Haven't read Rose Fritz's yet, but yeah, most people just write instructional stuff. Margaret Owen was really the only person who talked a bit about her own life too, and it made it so much better than the other books, in my opinion. I hope that I might be able to find more information on George Hosfield and Cortez Peters Jr. from their books, but there was almost nothing. They were purely instructional guides, and I'd honestly say the instructional material online is better than anything in those books, even though they were much better typists than most people today. Yep, Tim, I did mention you. Oh wow, Michael dedicated streams to people. Um, Typeracer purging out hard texts. I guess that's what most people want. So the people have spoken. I mean, I would have voted against it if I cared. I didn't really care. You can still access this stuff if you're a premium member on Typeracer. And the people who would really want to type the hard text, they're going to be seriously hardcore users, and they're probably almost all premium members anyway. Um, yeah, Gary, of course I noticed you. You were one of the few who I think beat me, especially in like that 2012 era when there was not much going on and almost nobody good who wasn't cheating except for me, Chris Momquist, and Fida. I definitely remember you from back then, Gary. Um, JJ, my main hobbies throughout most of my life were um Scrabble, auto racing, and mostly collecting statistics about auto racing. I was primarily into NASCAR and IndyCar, but a bit into everything. Um, I was into math quite a bit as a very little kid, and 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 I was always somewhat into computers. I made tons of websites when I was a little kid, but really I never really progressed to be any kind of serious professional. I'm still just an amateur, but I was always more interested in statistics and displaying content anyway than like having a good visual design or knowing a lot about the hardcore nitty-gritty. Um, yeah, Mako was one of the very few that combined athletics and typing along with Alpha Panda and Eric Triter. It wasn't many people, but yeah, it's an it's a rare combination, and it's rare to be that in balance. Most of us aren't. Um, Thank you, Ethan. I've been talking about the typing book the entirety of this thing. You'll have to rewind that if that's possible, or watch when I finish recording, which I will in 5 or 10 minutes. But um, so just replay this when I'm done. I went through the entire book just now, but I guess you showed up late. Um, Joseph, what I mainly use to do my data entry is PHP MyAdmin, and I use a graphical user interface for it on HostGator, which is the host that I use. Yeah, I'm pretty cheap, but they allowed me to stream all through or stream. They allowed me to host all three of my sites essentially on a single domain name. So I have racedatabase.com, seanrona.com, and racermetrics.com, um, all on one server. So HostGator gave me a really good deal on that Black Friday some year. But I mean, I think all they really have is PHP, MyAdmin, and some really chintzy command line interface I never figured out how to use. But I finished collecting all my data, so I'm done with collecting my data for the book. I'm ready to write that chapter about people's typing styles and the fastest and slowest words and the fastest and slowest keys on the keyboard. Um, Gary, yeah, I liked racing you, but uh, 2012 to 2014 was by far and away the worst era of type racer. Not much was happening. There were very few good people around at all. I almost entirely lost interest and focused almost entirely on tournament Scrabble in that period. It got really boring. I mean, the main people who were there of interest were Chanman and Zivas, and they were both later banned for cheating, and the leaderboards were overrun by cheaters. That was a bad era. Michael DeRoche basically saved the site when he went on the scene in 2015. Um, I don't have my Patreon page finished yet, but I will probably link a description to it when I do that in the next couple of weeks after I finish the video and finish posting it. Does anybody have any other questions before I go offline? Okay, Tim. I'd like to find a conventional publisher, and I did apply to a couple, but and one of them specifically asked about my social media presence. I mean, I have one, and it's larger than a lot of people, but I wasn't quite famous enough for that publisher, I guess. But I'm hoping to use the Patreon to build an audience for a conventional book, but I will do PDF files with my content for all of my subscribers. But I want it to be more than just for my subscribers too. I think it would be cool to see if I could get this in bookstores and libraries. Um, I'm trying to finish at by the end of 2020, but and then it might be months after that before it's released, but I imagine the first half is going to go much faster since it's basically going to be mostly based on newspaper articles about the typists from the first half of the 20th century that I've already typed into files for each typist. All right. Anything else? Okay. A lot of visuals like graphs. All right. A lot of pictures for the early typists are in the public domain. So it is possible that I've read that all newspapers through the year 1923, and I think it adds a year every year, so I think it'll be 1924 now. All text in newspapers and all images through 1924 are supposedly in the public domain in the United States. Almost all the typing champions from 1906 to 1937 were from that era. So I could probably get pictures of all of them and their machines and stuff. I'd have a lot more trouble getting anything from the Barbara Blackburn, Ron Mingo, Cortez Peters Jr., Michael Shustov era. That is where I'd have the most trouble. I suppose I could have some of the elite typists today send me pictures of them typing if they want, or I could get screenshots. Keegan, you already sent me your screenshot of that time when there were 20 users with races above 200 words per minute in a single hour. I might use that. I might use screenshots of my own from various typing sites. I might use that graph you just gave me about people's typing speeds over certain character counts. Yeah. The Library of Congress. I'm not sure what I could access to for cheap on the Library of Congress online. I imagine it'll be cheaper than like LexisNexis or something, but that's possibly worth looking into. But honestly, those 60 years from 1923 to 1963, that would probably only mostly be useful for Margaret Hama and Stella Pajunas and the brief IBM era before the international championships stopped being held in 1946. But it could be useful for those two. It's already 12:30 in the morning. I need to get up and go on a bus at 7:30 at work. So no, it's already too late. I need to wrap this up. Sorry, JJ, but I don't know. Send me a Discord PM or something. Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm gonna go offline and end the stream now. Although if the live chat continues, no Foggy, I'm not gonna talk about that on stream.